Chapter 1. The Note Inside the Hollow Book. It was tucked between pages no one ever read, handwritten and unsigned. The morning light in St. Mary Mead had the stillness of a canvas yet to be touched by brush or breeze. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was. For decades the village had moved with the gentle rhythm of shelves being dusted, kettles boiling, and footsteps across cobbled streets that never hurried and never stopped. And yet, just as ink bleeds through paper when left too long in silence, something unfamiliar had begun to surface. The bookshop sat at the far end of the square, shadowed by a pair of birch trees that hadn't grown an inch since the war. It was called Page and Spine. An odd name, given that no one could recall when it opened or who exactly ran it. People came in, people browsed, but if one were to ask who sold them the books, they would shrug, as if realizing they hadn't thought about it until that moment. You chose your book, left the coins in a brass bowl by the till, and walked out. It was that kind of place. That morning, it was Mrs. Weatherby who first noticed something strange. She had arrived just after 9, as she always did, in search of a poetry collection she was certain she'd seen but could never quite locate. The front door was unlocked, a surprise, since she was usually the one to wait outside until the "open" sign was turned. She stepped in. The bell above the door gave its usual weary jingle, but no reply came. No voice from the back, no shuffle of feet, only the creak of wood that seemed, somehow, to be listening. She wandered in further. Fiction section, F. That's where she had seen the collection. 5th shelf down, 3rd book from the right. But when she reached for it, her hand caught something odd. A draft. A breath of air where there should have been solid shelf. The wood shifted slightly. She leaned in, the shelf moved, and behind it was something she would never forget. Tucked behind the false shelf was a narrow crawl space lined with dust-coated books and one cracked globe. The globe was peculiar. It rested on its axis as though mid-spin, yet no one had touched it in years. Its equator was split. The Atlantic Ocean opened like a fault line. And curled against the wall, barely visible in the half-light, was the figure of a man. Head slumped forward, arms folded neatly, as if in rest. There was no sign of violence, no struggle, no chaos. Only stillness. An unsettling sort of stillness. She backed away slowly. Then, quickly, the police were called. The village froze. By noon, Miss Marple had heard the news, and by past, she had received the letter. It arrived without a stamp, slipped neatly into the mail slot like an apology too late. No return address. Just 4 lines on thick ivory paper, written in ink so dark it almost bled. He knew. He wrote it down. He left it in fiction section F. Find the hollow book. Miss Marple turned the note over. Nothing. Not even a watermark. Her fingers ran across the texture. Rag paper. Handmade. Not the sort of stationery found in local shops. She knew. She always knew the difference between ordinary and something not quite right. She left her tea to cool and took her coat from the hook. Inside the bookshop, the police were already combing through the back room. Officers moved with polite professionalism, careful not to disturb the delicate arrangement of old things. A constable nodded as Miss Marple entered, allowing her through without question. She was, after all, as much a part of the village as the church steeple or the rustling hedges. She walked to fiction section F, slowly, thoughtfully. There was no visible disturbance. The books were in their usual faded order, Dickens, Du Maurier, Forster. But she noticed something the others hadn't. One of the titles didn't match. A green spine with no title, just a pair of initials, R-E-E. She reached out and pressed her fingers to it. The book moved. Not opened. Shifted. Like a button in a much larger mechanism. There was a faint click. A second shelf creaked open an inch. Inside was the hollow. A carved-out space within the shelf itself, lined with felt, and empty but for one item. A second letter. This one folded into the cover of a novel she'd never seen before. The novel had no author, no publisher, no copyright page, only a single word on the cover, unspoken. She opened it. The pages were blank, except for one, dead center. In handwriting identical to the first note, it read, "You've read this before, but not all of it." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. The floor beneath her shifted almost imperceptibly, as though something deep beneath the shop had exhaled. She slipped the note into her handbag, eyes scanning the room, not for suspects, but for gaps. Missing time, misplaced context, something that didn't belong. The man behind the false shelf had still not been identified. No wallet, no ID, only a silver ring on his left hand, etched with a crest that no one could recognize. No signs of how he'd entered or how long he'd been there. But the broken globe, that was a detail Miss Marple couldn't ignore. Globes do not crack without force, and force leaves traces. Yet the surface was smooth, as though it had split open from within. What did he know? What had he written down? She looked back at the shelf, at the green spine labelled R.E. She checked the shop's registry, what there was of it. There was no such book, no such initials, no record. And yet it had been waiting there. Outside, the village resumed its rhythm. Birds chirped. A bus passed. Church bells tolled the hour. Inside, Miss Marple remained still, eyes fixed on a wall of fiction that now held more truth than any one person should know, and the camera would slowly zoom in, not on her, but on the shelf behind her. The green spine, the dust gathering in the grooves of its cover, and then, just before the scene fades to black, a second set of initials barely visible at the bottom of the spine. A.M. The initials of a man who had vanished 70 years earlier and who was never found. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And now, perhaps, for us. If you're the kind of person who notices the missing things, what's out of place or left unsaid, subscribe. You may find, in time, that this story was written with you in mind. Chapter 2. The background. The bookshop nobody owned. The village of St. Mary Mead had long prided itself on its memory. Names, addresses, birthplaces, who had married whom, and which cousin had scandalously relocated to a coastal town without so much as a farewell, nothing escaped its collective recall. But when it came to page and spine, the recollections faded like ink under too much sunlight. Everyone remembered it being there, of course. Everyone had been inside at some point, or at least claimed to. But if asked to describe the face of the shopkeeper, the year it first opened, or even how many windows lined the back wall, there was a pause, and then a polite laugh, and then a change of subject. It had changed hands 5 times in 10 years. That much was recorded, or at least whispered. But ownership, as Miss Marple would soon discover, was a matter of official silence. No tax records, no rent agreements, no deed registered at the county office. Every inquiry led to an answer that looked solid on the surface, until inspected closely. Then it crumbled, and still the shop remained open. Books were sold, coins were exchanged, titles disappeared from shelves, only to reappear days later with dust in the same patterns as before, as if they had never truly left. But now, with a man found curled behind a false shelf, a cracked globe, and a hollow book bearing no author, Miss Marple was certain this was no ordinary place, and it never had been. She stood that evening by her window, watching the lights of the shop flicker faintly through the trees. The constables had locked the doors, placed a temporary seal and driven off with polite haste, but she knew the lights had not been there earlier. Someone, something, had returned. Her memory drifted, uninvited, to a case long sealed by time. It was 1948, the year of ration books and quiet streets, when the village still wore the dust of war beneath its polite smiles. A young woman, Emily Ratchford, had gone missing. 26 years old, unmarried, working as a typist for a firm in Oxford. She had visited her aunt in St. Mary Mead for the summer. One day, she told her aunt she was off to find something old to read, something Gothic. She walked toward the square with her umbrella and vanished. Not a trace, not a footprint, just her library card, returned by post with a note. She found what she was looking for. At the time, the disappearance was absorbed into wartime forgetfulness. People were lost, after all, records misplaced, and Miss Marple, preoccupied with a different case, had taken only a passing interest. But now it felt like the first thread of a much older tapestry, one that someone had tried very hard to keep hidden. She returned to the bookshop the next morning before the frost had melted, coat pulled tightly against the wind that seemed to hush the square. She circled the building, observing details most might miss. A second chimney sealed over with concrete, a windowless door facing the alley, locked from the inside, and ivy trailing up the eastern wall that didn't seem to grow from the soil below. Everything appeared intact, but felt incomplete. At the rear corner, hidden behind a compost bin, she spotted something new. A strip of paper, aged, yellowed and folded carefully, tucked between two loose bricks. With a gloved hand, she drew it out. It was a ledger page. Not a full record, but a torn fragment. Ink faded at the edges, but the handwriting, elegant, deliberate, was unmistakable. She had seen it once before, on a postcard addressed to Colonel Hastings. It belonged to a man thought to be long dead. Initials in the corner, A.M. She turned the page. It listed 4 titles. None were familiar, and none matched any known ISBN or publication record. Each was followed by a note. Entry accepted, withheld from public. Entry rejected, language too revealing. Entry accepted, filed under fiction. Entry pending, pending left unread. It was then that Miss Marple understood. This was not a shop. Not entirely, it was a gate. A gate through which stories entered, but did not always leave. She returned home, hands cold despite her gloves. She lit the fire, placed the ledger page under glass, and began to reconstruct the timeline. Emily Ratchford, 1948, unpublished manuscripts. A man found behind a false shelf, a cracked globe, a book with no title, and a second one with initials. R.E. And now, the initials A.M., known only to those who remembered one particular name. Andrew Merrick. He had been a bookbinder, a ghostwriter, a man who once claimed he could make people disappear inside fiction, literally, not metaphorically. His writings had been dismissed as nonsense. He vanished in 1951, presumed lost in a boating accident. But Miss Marple had always wondered. She sifted through her records, her notes, clippings, letters, and she found it. His name on a donation list for a literary fund, submitted anonymously in 1946. That donation had funded the construction of a shop, a modest building, small, with a peculiar name. Page and Spine. She leaned back in her chair. Nothing about this place was accidental. Not its name, not its contents, and certainly not its timing. Whoever, or whatever, had placed the man behind that false shelf had done so not to conceal him entirely, but to ensure he would eventually be found. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. She looked again at the green-spined book, R.E., and considered the placement. Fiction Section F, alphabetized shelves. But what if the book wasn't filed by title or author, but by what it knew? She turned her attention to the torn ledger again. The 4th entry, author vanished. No name, no date, just that. Had someone written their truth into a book? Had the bookshop become a kind of library for things never meant to be read? And if so, who was curating it? She made tea, not because she needed it, but because ritual allowed for reflection. The steam rose in soft ribbons, curling like the thoughts she couldn't yet place. There was no doubt now that Emily Ratchford's disappearance was part of this, just as there was no doubt that the shop had its own memory, the kind that didn't fade but rewrote itself. Quietly, precisely, dangerously. There was one more thing. In the torn ledger page, the ink smudge along the bottom was not a smudge at all. It was a thumbprint, and the ridge pattern matched exactly the one found on the back of the hollow book. Someone had written the story. Someone had placed the body, but someone else had catalogued it. Miss Marple folded the page gently, slipped it back beneath the glass, and wrote down one line in her own handwriting. Stories don't end when we stop reading. They end when someone decides we shouldn't. And as the firelight flickered across her notes, across old memories and forgotten names, she looked toward the square once more. The bookshop lights had returned, dim, flickering, watching. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. If you've been following each quiet clue, each whispered line, then perhaps you're ready for what comes next. Subscribe. There's always another page, just out of reach. Chapter 3. Ink That Shouldn't Fade. The signature said 1956, but the ink was barely a week old. It was shortly after midnight when Miss Marple returned to the bookshop. Not physically, but in thought. The kind of thought that sharpens over a quiet room and a ticking mantel clock, when memory begins sorting itself like old files at the back of an unattended drawer. The torn ledger still lay beneath its glass, the fireplace down to its final embers, casting long shadows across the study wall. And yet, her mind was not in her home at all. It was inside the narrow aisles of page and spine, drawn back to a single green spine and the unshakable feeling that the story had already begun without her. That morning the constable had brought by the latest findings. The body behind the false shelf remained unidentified, though early impressions hinted at someone out of place. No personal belongings save for the silver ring and, oddly enough, a single library card. The card belonged to Camden Public Archive, a library long since closed. On the reverse side was a signature. Deliberate, precise, almost boastful. It read, L. Worthing, 1956. At first glance, the date appeared to place the card decades into the past, but Miss Marple's eye caught something else, something most others wouldn't have noticed. The ink shimmered. Ordinary ink dulls with time, especially under pressure or exposure, but this gleamed faintly under the inspector's desk lamp, and when she asked, ever so politely, whether the ink had been tested, the sergeant had simply blinked and said, "We're not in London, Miss Marple. No lab here does that sort of thing." But the next day, they had. A contact at the museum in nearby Bath ran the ink under microscopic analysis, and the result was curious enough to land back on Miss Marple's kitchen table by evening. The ink was fresh, no older than 7 days, but the signature dated back nearly 70 years. And that name, L. Worthing, rang a very particular bell. She shuffled through her private files, newspaper clippings, unpublished trial summaries. And there he was, Lawrence Worthing, a former antiquarian and literary forger who had once planted false confessions into the flyleaves of historical novels. In 1961, he had been arrested for forging a handwritten note attributed to Tennyson, hidden no less inside a copy of The Princess. What unsettled the court wasn't simply the forgery, but that the note described an actual event, one that hadn't come to light until after the book had been opened. Worthing claimed innocence, even laughed during trial. He was sentenced to 5 years, and then he disappeared. 1 month before his release, he vanished from his cell without explanation. His bed had been slept in, his cell locked from the inside. No sign of struggle, no prints, just gone. And now his name appeared again, signed inside a book pulled from Fiction Section F, titled The Final Account. Miss Marple read it carefully, line by line, more than once. It wasn't so much a novel as a memoir, written in the cadence of someone who knew too much and trusted too few. The story described a small village not unlike St. Mary Mead, A bookshop with a hidden chamber, a man who forged truths to hide the real ones. The final chapter was missing, but in the back cover, pressed tightly beneath the spine, was something else. A letter, folded 4 times, tucked so precisely that it may have never been found had she not run her finger along the seam. She unfolded it with care. The handwriting was the same as the note from the hollow book. This time it said, "You are looking for what isn't there. That is where it always hides. Tell no one. The clock is listening." She read the words again, slowly, then turned toward her own clock, silent, but watching. She took the letter and returned to the bookshop before dawn. The seal had been removed curiously, as though someone expected her return. The lock gave no resistance. The shelves were precisely as she had left them, except for one. A small, battered dictionary now sat on the counter where no books had been the day before. It looked ordinary, leather-bound, fraying at the corners, the kind children might use for spelling contests in old classrooms. She approached, opened it. Near the centre, wedged between the words regret and relic, was a pressed flower. Perfectly preserved, a forget-me-not, blue petals uncrushed, as if it had only just been plucked. And beneath it, a signature, L. Worthing. She turned the page, nothing more. But she recognised the handwriting. It matched not only the library card and the letter, but also something far older. Something folded in the back of her mind for years. She returned home with the dictionary in hand, placed it beside the ledger fragment, and began to work. First, the name, L. Worthing. She rearranged the letters, over and over. Then it revealed itself, right of news. No, too forced. She tried again. Not W. Grief, closer but wrong, and then ring of With. She paused. The silver ring, the one found on the man behind the shelf, engraved with an unknown crest, its meaning elusive. She looked again at the dictionary. The flower, forget-me-not, the only thing in the book not written or typed, something natural, something alive, a warning, or an invitation? The silence wasn't empty. It was watching. And then something else occurred to her. The pressed flower was fresh, which meant the book had been placed there, recently, by someone who knew she would find it, someone playing a long game, or writing one. She compared the handwriting again, and this time she noticed something no analyst had. The letters were almost, but not quite, identical. Each one bore the same curvature, the same pressure, but in subtly shifting patterns, as if written by the same hand on different days. Or by different hands trained to write identically. A method once used in espionage during wartime, a way to forge authorship or confuse analysts. Each agent trained to write in the same hand. But why? Unless the author didn't matter. Unless the idea was to make one author seem like many, or many like one. The ledger, the fake books, the pressed flower, the blank-paged novel, and now this. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, not exhausted, not yet, but wary. This was not a mystery to be solved in the traditional sense. This was a manuscript in progress, and someone was still writing. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And now, perhaps, for you. If you've followed the footprints this far, you might already be part of the story. Subscribe. Subscribe. There's more hidden between the lines. Chapter 4. The teacup left untouched. In villages like St. Mary Mead, news travels not by newspaper, but by breath. One whispered comment in a butcher's queue becomes 5 versions by lunchtime, and by evening a mystery is already fully formed. Names assigned, motives guessed, verdicts rendered, and yet somehow the true details remain untouched, smoothed over by habit, lost beneath the chatter. It was on such a morning, grey skies pressing low, the scent of coal smoke drifting from chimneys, that the whispers began. They spoke of a man. Not the one found behind the false shelf, no. This was someone else. A visitor none had seen arrive, but all seemed to remember once prompted. A man with a limp, they said, one leg dragging slightly behind the other, a movement soft enough to be unnoticed until you looked again. He had a dark coat, high-collared, gloves too heavy for spring, and, most distinct of all, he carried a black envelope. No one saw his face clearly, but everyone recalled his presence. Too calm for the room, too careful with the floorboards, as if measuring his weight against something he already expected to collapse. Miss Marple heard of him first from the vicar's wife, who had stopped by that morning with a tray of preserves and a string of sentences that began, as such things do, with the phrase, "Now, I don't want to speculate, but..." She listened, gracious as always, but it wasn't until the envelope was mentioned that her teacup paused mid-air. A black envelope. That was no coincidence. In certain wartime circles, envelopes of that kind were used for sealed operations. Untraceable, coded. Miss Marple had seen one once, many years ago, in the hands of a man who disappeared shortly after a chess match held in a train station waiting room. She rose from her chair, not bothering with gloves, and returned to the bookshop. It was open again. No one had seen anyone unlock it. The police had no record of returning, but the sign now read "Open" in faint, uneven letters, and the bell above the door gave the same weary jingle as before. Inside, nothing had moved, or so it seemed. She made her way toward the back room. Not the shelf, she'd studied that already, but the small parlour tucked behind the curtain, where shopkeepers were known to sit when the wind chilled the square. And there it was. A single teacup, placed perfectly at the centre of a round oak table. Steam no longer rose from it, but when she pressed a finger to the side, it was still faintly warm. Not recent, but not forgotten. Someone had left in haste or with precision. Next to the cup, untouched, was a spoon. Still clean, no sugar residue, no lip mark on the rim. The tea had never been drunk. She examined the table. No indentations in the cushion of the chair. The dust around the legs undisturbed. It was as if someone had placed the cup and walked away before even sitting down. Miss Marple reached out, slowly, and tilted the cup to its side. Beneath it, faint but deliberate, was a mark etched into the wood. Not by mistake, not by wear. An arrow, pointing northwest. Her gaze followed the line, across the parlour wall, to a narrow cast-iron fireplace, long thought to be ornamental. She knelt beside it. The chimney was blocked. Not clogged, not filled with soot, blocked. From the inside. Something had been wedged upward, carefully, intentionally. And whatever it was, it had been smoothed over with ash and aged dust, to make it appear natural. She called for the constable, who arrived 30 minutes later with the necessary tools and a nervous demeanour. He removed the blockage inch by inch, until at last something dropped into his hands. It was a bundle of papers, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, bound with a black ribbon, and tucked between the pages, a familiar handwriting. The same script found in the hollow book, the same that marked the letter she had received, the same that wrote the name L. Worthing inside the dictionary, only now the message was briefer. Wrong body, right place. She read the line again, and then a third time. What had begun as a search for identity, who the man behind the shelf had been, was no longer the question. Someone had been expected, someone else. The implications settled over her like dusk. This was not simply a forgotten man in a forgotten shop. This was a mistake. Or worse, a substitution. Miss Marple stood in the centre of the parlour, allowing the dust to gather at her feet. She pictured it. A visitor with a limp enters the shop. He carries a black envelope. He prepares tea, but before he drinks, something changes. A noise, a message. A second visitor. He leaves the cup. The tea cools. A body is found. But the man behind the shelf is not him. And the envelope? Missing. She left the shop in silence. The constable said little. His mouth was set in a line he could not explain. Miss Marple returned home and sat by the fire, her mind looping the events like a phonograph with a scratch. Who had placed the teacup? Why leave it untouched? Why block the chimney? And what was meant to remain hidden in it? And most of all, who was the message for? There was one possibility, one she hesitated to admit even to herself. The note had not been addressed, but it had been meant, and meant, most likely, for her. She retrieved the oilcloth bundle from her drawer, carefully unwrapping its contents. The pages inside were worn but not old. A set of notes, diagrams, sketches, even excerpts from what appeared to be unpublished novels. Each one described events eerily close to the real world. A murder at a bakery that never occurred, but matched a dream once written in a young girl's diary. A locked room case in Paris that had no police report, but was referenced in a letter to Hercule Poirot. And one final sketch, a blueprint of page and spine, complete, accurate and detailed, drawn before the shop had ever existed on paper. Miss Marple closed the pages and folded her hands. She was beginning to understand. This was no ordinary bookshop, no ordinary visitor, and certainly no ordinary death. Someone was constructing something. Not just stories, but reality. Layered, intentional, hidden in margins, pressed between petals and hollowed wood. And yet, the tea had not been drunk, which meant someone had chosen to wait, or had been interrupted. And if they had been interrupted, then what had they left behind? There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. If this story has held you in its grasp, if the threads feel familiar but unread, subscribe. You've already turned the page, now see what's written beneath it. Chapter 5. The Librarian Who Knew Too Much. The thing about secrets is, they are never truly hidden. They are placed, positioned, catalogued quietly in the corners of a place where no one is meant to look, with the quiet hope that someone, someday, will. And in St. Mary Mead, where memory runs deeper than bloodlines, Miss Marple had long learned that knowledge tends to survive in the hands of the overlooked. That's how she came to speak with Edith Lane. Miss Lane had been the village librarian once, long before the war. She was a woman rarely seen, and even less frequently spoken of, the sort whose name sparked a squint rather than a story. She had retired decades ago and lived now in a crooked house at the edge of the wood, where curtains were always drawn and no postman ever lingered. Most believed her deaf, others thought her absent-minded, but Miss Marple, who had once seen the woman correct a misquoted Latin inscription from 20 paces away, suspected otherwise. The invitation was simple. A note tucked beneath her garden gate. Come alone, bring nothing, say nothing of tea. Miss Marple obliged. The lane that led to Edith's cottage was narrow, the kind meant for footsteps, not wheels. The air was damp, the branches heavy, and somewhere in the distance, a clock tower rang 5. The door opened before she knocked. Edith Lane stood in the shadow of it, eyes sharp beneath a halo of untamed grey. She said nothing, only stepped aside and led her guest into a room that smelled faintly of dust, pine and something older, like pages that had never been turned. Books filled the walls, the tables, even the chairs, but none had titles on their spines. Some were bound in raw cloth, others in cracked leather. Every one of them was nameless. Miss Marple took a seat offered silently. The chair creaked but held. After a pause long enough to be deliberate, Edith spoke. I was hired in 1971, she said, voice low and controlled, by someone who never gave me a name. The payment came in cash, no contract, no address, just instructions. What kind of instructions? Miss Marple asked gently. To catalogue, she replied, but not all books, only the ones already marked. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Marked how? They had no titles, Edith continued. No authors, just numbers, dates. Some were written by hand, others were copied. A few were etched. A word not used lightly. She gestured toward a cupboard. Inside, beneath several layers of parchment, lay a small wooden case. It bore no lock, only a wax seal with the imprint of an open book. Edith cracked it open and withdrew a thin manuscript, brittle at the edges, its cover faded beyond colour. Across the top, in ink barely visible, was written, Chapter 13. No title before it, no preface, no chapters preceding it. Only this. Miss Marple reached for it, but Edith held it back. There's something else, she said. When I was first shown the back room, at Page and Spine, I was told never to speak of it, not even to the owner. But I was under the impression, Miss Marple said carefully, that no one owns the shop. Edith looked at her for a long time, and then she said, almost as a whisper, exactly. She placed the manuscript into Miss Marple's hands. The pages were thin, the ink uneven, as if written in haste but revised with great care. Each line was a fragment, a continuation of something never shown. There were no names, only initials, no dialogue, only description. It felt like entering the second half of a conversation without ever hearing the first. But then, on the third page, lower margin, scrawled in a different hand, "Burn before reading." The ink was different, fresher, blacker, familiar. Miss Marple froze. She had seen this hand before, not once but many times, on postcards, on recipes, on letters sent decades ago. A hand she had believed long buried, not in myth or rumour, but in fact. She flipped to the final page of the manuscript. There, resting in the corner, was a symbol she had not seen in 40 years. A triangle, broken at the base. It had once marked the correspondence of a man who claimed to be more archivist than author. A man who disappeared in 1951 from a ferry docked in Dover, last seen boarding but never disembarking. His name? Andrew Merrick. And he had once written Miss Marple a letter that began with the line, "I'm not writing to you, I'm writing through you." She stood. The room shifted, not in motion, but in meaning. She thanked Edith Lane, who merely nodded and turned away, retreating into the shadows of her books, as if waiting for a different story to begin. Back home, Miss Marple placed the manuscript beneath her study lamp, but did not open it further. She stared at the note once more. Burn before reading. What could be so dangerous, not in action, but in understanding, that its discovery came with a warning not to know? She left it there, untouched, for now. The clock struck 6. The wind pressed against the window, soft but certain. And somewhere between the tick and the silence, she understood what had been building all along. This was not simply a mystery of books or of a single man's fate. This was a conflict of stories themselves, of which narratives are allowed to survive and which are silenced before they ever begin. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her, and perhaps waiting for you. If you've been following the edges of this story, if the blank spaces feel louder than the words, subscribe. What's coming next is something no one ever meant to be read. Chapter 6. The Man with the Empty Case. In St. Mary Mead, strangers never arrive unnoticed. There is no train station, no bus terminal, no logical reason for an unfamiliar face to appear at the inn without first being announced in whispers. And so, when the man arrived, coat heavy with dust, satchel weathered, collar turned slightly to one side, it was not his presence that drew attention, but the silence that followed it. He spoke little, smiled often, and signed nothing. No one saw him arrive. There were no taxi tracks, no ticket stubs, and when the landlord at the Crown and Thorn asked him his name, he replied only, "Just passing through." But something in his voice felt familiar. Not in tone, but in rhythm, as if reading from a page he had already memorized. The man kept to himself mostly, ordering weak tea he didn't drink, taking long walks through the village that never passed the same road twice. The only object he ever carried was a leather satchel. Too small for clothing, too large for mere paper, and always closed with a buckle that bore no brand or stamp. When asked, He claimed he was researching rare literary fraud, a phrase that sounded rehearsed and somehow deliberately unconvincing. Miss Marple, as always, noticed more than she said. Their first meeting was unplanned, at least on her part. He appeared at her garden gate 2 days after the incident at the bookshop, hands gloved, hat in hand. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I suspect you are," she replied softly, but only mildly. He laughed, politely, then said something she hadn't expected. "You don't look as old as your reputation." She tilted her head, not smiling. "And you don't look as anonymous as you're trying to be." There was a pause, long enough to mark a shift. He stepped back, bowed slightly, and said no more. He didn't offer his name, but as he turned to leave, he glanced toward her gatepost and added, "The real clues are never on the page, they're between the lines." She watched him walk away, his left leg dragged ever so slightly, the same limp described by those who had seen the man with the black envelope, but this one had no envelope, only the satchel, and a smile too easily worn. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Crown and Thorn to inquire. The innkeeper confirmed the stranger had taken room 4 corner window, overlooking the square, but when asked for more, he hesitated. "He's odd, that one," the man said. "Carries nothing but paper. Writes in the dark. Doesn't lock the door, but he always locks the satchel." Miss Marple thanked him, left a note in the registry, and returned home. That evening, she saw no light in room 4. The next morning, the room was empty. The man had vanished. No trace, no bill paid, no prints left behind. The room had been tidied, but not cleaned. The bed was made, but the pillows bore no indent. The only sign that someone had ever stayed there was a single sheet of paper left on the desk, folded once. Miss Marple received it not from the innkeeper, but from a constable who had found it curious enough to pass along. The page was typed, yellowed at the corners. Its header read, "Extract from the Violet Hour, an unpublished manuscript by A.C." Beneath it, a passage. He found the man slumped behind the second shelf, knees bent as if in prayer, one shoe off, a broken globe shattered across the carpet. There was no blood, only stillness, and the unmistakable scent of rose-wax ink. Miss Marple reread the lines, slowly, deliberately. Her breath held. That description, word for word, matched the scene in the bookshop. The man behind the false shelf, the globe cracked, the positioning, even the missing shoe. None of this had been released to the public, not even the constables had mentioned the ink. And yet, here it was, on a page written decades ago, attributed to the initials A.C. Agatha Christie herself. But this manuscript had never been published. No title by that name appeared in any bibliography, no draft stored in the Christie archives, no record, no reference, nothing. And yet the scene was exact. She flipped the page. There was nothing more. No closing paragraph, just a single line typed at the bottom in a smaller font. "You are reading what was never meant to happen." Miss Marple sat very still. Her eyes drifted to her fireplace, where the manuscript marked Chapter 13 remained sealed in its oilcloth. The words, "burn before reading," still whispered from its cover. And now, this. It wasn't just that fiction mirrored life, it was that life seemed to be following fiction, lines written, scenes described, and somehow lived. She turned the page over. In the bottom left corner, written in faint pencil, was a number, 24,613. A code? A catalogue entry? She didn't know. But the satchel, the stranger, the limp. He had come for something. Not for her. Not for answers. But for placement. To be seen, then to vanish. And yet, he had known her name. Not just in passing, not in rumour, he had spoken it with certainty. As if he had read her before. She searched her archives, her journals. every recorded case, every letter exchanged. And finally, in a collection of notes she had taken from a conference in 1963, an address never published, she found it. 24,613. It was the code used in a restricted library vault in Vienna, known for housing manuscripts of disputed origin. Manuscripts written under names that didn't exist, yet described real events. Miss Marple made a note, folded the page, and understood for the first time the scope of what had begun to unfold. Someone, perhaps more than one, was orchestrating stories that predict the real, or worse, that shape it. And someone else had left the door ajar, just wide enough for her to notice. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And now, waiting for you. If you've followed every clue, if the fiction feels too real and the real too rehearsed, subscribe. There's more written than ever meant to be read. Chapter 7. The Clock That Didn't Tick. The night after the man behind the shelf was found, a sound returned to St. Mary Mead that no one had heard in nearly a decade. It happened at exactly midnight. Not the soft cry of an owl, nor the rustling of wind through dry hedges. Those were expected. What no one could quite place, at least not at first, was the sharp chime of a grandfather clock echoing faintly from the square. It struck once, then twice, then 12 times, each slower than the last. Miss Marple sat up in bed the moment she heard it, not startled, not frightened, only alert, as one would be upon hearing an old friend speak after years of silence. She knew the sound well. The clock it came from stood in the corner of page and spine, behind the reading chair that no one ever used, and beside the window that never opened. It had been there for as long as the shop itself. She remembered the faded hands stuck eternally at 10:47, the glass fogged slightly from the inside. For years it had done nothing more than exist, and yet, last night, it had chimed. She rose before dawn, dressed quickly, and stepped into the square while the village still slept. The shop was closed, as expected, the curtains drawn, but the faintest light glowed beneath the door, flickering, not electrical, candlelight. She didn't try the door this time. She simply watched and then turned away. An hour later, the constable arrived with news. The will had been found. Not of the man behind the shelf, his identity still a mystery, but of the former shopkeeper, a recluse named Giles Corwin, a name not heard in public since 1974, presumed long gone, though no obituary was ever printed. The will was dated 1968, and yet the ink had not faded, the paper perfectly preserved. It had been discovered behind the false shelf, inside a hollow volume of the Count of Monte Cristo, filed curiously under R. And on the final page of the will, after a series of legal formalities and impersonal bequests, was a single line written in a different hand. To Miss Jane Marple, I leave what remains unread. The truth is hers, if she still knows how to find it. No mention of property, no financial assets, no tangible goods, only a phrase, a gesture, a puzzle hidden in ink. Miss Marple did not react visibly, but in her mind another piece slid into place. Not an answer, but a space shaped like one. Later that day a new question arrived, not in ink or code, but in the absence of someone expected. Thomas Rayner, an occasional visitor to the village and a collector of rare first editions, had not returned to his room at the inn. His suitcase remained unpacked. The tea he had ordered that morning sat untouched by his door. The key to room 6 was found still in his coat pocket, folded neatly over a receipt from Page and Spine. The receipt listed one title, No One Leaves. Red cover, no author. Miss Marple returned to the bookshop before dusk. She asked no one for permission and waited for no escort. Inside, everything remained as before. Dust layered just thin enough to notice disturbance, but thick enough to mark intent. She searched along the N shelf. Nothing. Then she stopped. Beneath the reading chair, tucked between the clock and the wall, stood a cart of books waiting to be shelved. And there, in the middle of it, spine frayed and cover faded, was a red volume with no title. Only a library sticker long scratched off. She pulled it out, opened it. The first few pages read like any other novel. A woman in a strange town, a letter that leads nowhere, a door that disappears when turned away from. But the prose was cold, mechanical, each paragraph more clinical than the last. Then, 20 pages from the end, nothing, not even blankness. The pages had been torn out, not ripped in haste, removed carefully with a blade or scalpel, as if someone had meant for it to look clean. She traced the edge with her fingers. A fragment of one torn leaf remained. On it, a single word, cut in half. Remember. And then, silence. She replaced the book gently. The clock behind her remained still, but she felt something else. A change, subtle, quiet, like someone watching, not from behind a curtain, but from inside the story itself. Back home, she cross-referenced the book title against every known catalogue, public and private. Nothing. No record, no reference, no mention of a novel called No One Leaves. But when she searched again, under authorless entries, she found something else. A manuscript fragment, misfiled, unsigned, dated only 1953. Stored in the archives of a defunct publisher. The description read, "A novel submitted without contact information, withdrawn before publication, contents unknown. Title page read, No One Leaves." The notes beside the record were more disturbing. Bet question destroyed. Author untraceable. Marked in red ink, do not file under fiction. And now, the book had surfaced. Physically, undeniably, in her hands. Thomas Rayner had been seen leaving the shop with it. He had not been seen since. The grandfather clock had not worked in years. But now it ticked. Or more precisely, it chimed. Once, then again, then 12. Not the passing of time, but the marking of it. The marking of a moment. Something had happened. Something had returned. And Miss Marple, standing again at the centre of a story no one had finished writing, realised the truth was no longer hiding in shadows. It was hiding in structure, in margins, in the very mechanism of narrative. The truth, perhaps, had never been buried. Only withheld. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. If you've read between the lines, if the chime of fiction has started to echo, subscribe. The next chapter turns itself. Chapter 8, The Book That Wasn't There. It began with a list. Not a confession, not quite a diary, but a ledger of sorts. Half-finished thoughts, page numbers, phrases jotted in the margins. It had been tucked in the coat pocket of the man found behind the shelf, folded 3 times and brittle with age. The handwriting changed midway through. The first half was careful, methodical, the marks of someone cataloguing a trail only he could follow. The second, shakier, as if written in haste or under watch. One title appeared again and again, The Ashfield Inheritance. Miss Marple had seen many titles in her life, some real, some imagined, but this one stood out. Not because it was familiar, but because it wasn't. Not in any way that made sense. She searched the usual places. Local library, regional archives, first edition registries, no match. Not under Ashfield, not under Inheritance, not in crime fiction, memoir, gothic or obscure literary fiction, nothing in the Christie estate records, nor in unpublished fragments stored in private hands. She widened her search. Even private collector logs, still nothing. The book did not exist. And yet, it had been cited 7 times in the man's notes, specific page numbers, specific quotes. And more curiously still, each mention corresponded to something that had happened. A red envelope. A body found behind a false shelf. A book with no final chapter. the chiming of a broken clock. Each one in turn referenced with eerie precision, as if the events themselves had been transcribed first, then lived. It was a strange reversal, a ghost of logic, but something about it made sense. Not to the world, but to Miss Marple. She returned to the shop. This time her attention fell on the narrow wall behind the crime scene. The shelves had been rearranged since the discovery, but one object remained untouched. A mirror, old and mottled, framed in tarnished brass. It faced away from the shelf, oddly placed, decorative perhaps, but never useful. And yet, when she turned it slightly, just slightly, it captured a reflection that should not have been there. A figure, standing in the far corner of the shop near the window, holding a book, a red one, but the reflection was not the man behind the shelf, nor was it the stranger with the limp. This figure wore a coat lined with velvet, a style out of place in modern times. The reflection was grainy, imperfect, but clear enough to confirm one thing. The person holding the book that night was not the victim. She stepped back from the mirror, let the silence return, and suddenly the room felt altered. Not different, just watched. That evening, she reconstructed the timeline once more. It no longer aligned. The chime at midnight, the untouched teacup, the vanishing guest, the missing book, the false will, and now the reflection of a figure who was never seen, holding a book that never existed. But it did exist. It had to. Because someone had read it, someone had referenced it, and most damning of all, someone had been inside it. That thought, fleeting, absurd, rooted itself in her mind and refused to leave, not at the scene, not reading the story, but inside. She opened her notebook and wrote 3 words. Original murder site. What if the murder, or rather the event, hadn't happened in the shop at all? What if it had happened within the story of the shop? A replication, a performance, a reprint of something that had already been written down. She took out the partial manuscript labelled Chapter 13, the one marked burn before reading, and placed it beside the latest note. It contained no mention of Ashfield, but its tone matched the entries in the victim's notes. Descriptions of rooms rearranging themselves, of clocks keeping time that no longer passed, of books that knew things they shouldn't. And then she remembered something. Ashfield was the name of Agatha Christie's childhood home, not a common name, not a coincidence. She cross-checked the architectural records of the bookshop. The floor plan matched nothing on file in the county, but the upstairs apartment, long believed unused, had a peculiar layout, nearly identical to the blueprints of Ashfield Place, as recorded in the author's own sketchbook. Impossible. And yet, there it was. Had someone rebuilt the setting, copied the shape of a memory and hid it beneath stories? And if so, who would know how to do such a thing? She thought again of Andrew Merrick, of the manuscript with missing chapters, of the stranger who knew her name without introduction, of the torn-out pages, the silent envelope, the pressed flower still fresh. A pattern was emerging, not of evidence, but of intent. Someone was constructing a narrative, page by page, using real people as characters and stories as camouflage, and now that story had reached its midpoint. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. Not something evil, not monstrous, but something designed, with lines between fiction and truth blurred to the point of erasure. She returned to the mirror once more. This time there was no reflection, only the room. And in the spot where the figure had stood, a faint print on the window pane, like the outline of a hand that had once rested there, long ago. She turned back to her notes, her books, her memories. Everything she knew, everything she'd ever solved, had logic at its core. But this was not logic. This was narrative, carefully structured, deliberately unfinished. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And now, for you. If you're still watching, still piecing it together, subscribe. The next chapter isn't written in ink, it's written in consequence. Chapter 9. The ink-stained glove. There is something particularly telling about an attic. It doesn't merely store what we no longer need, it holds what we refuse to let go of. Forgotten ledgers, unfinished stories, boxes with names no longer spoken. And in page and spine, where time itself seemed to lag behind the rest of St. Mary Mead, the attic had remained locked for as long as anyone could remember. It was only when the floorboards creaked in a pattern not quite natural, 3 slow, 1 soft, then silence, that Miss Marple decided to investigate. The key to the attic door had not been easy to locate. The constables had no record of one. The landlord denied knowledge of an upper floor, but Miss Marple, knowing better, retrieved a set of antique skeleton keys from her own study, one of which, curiously, matched the tarnished brass lock on the narrow stairwell behind the backroom curtain. The door opened without resistance, as if it had been expecting her. The attic air was dry, brittle, heavy with the scent of leather, ink, and something that resembled the underside of old paper. Dust lay thick but not undisturbed. Footprints crossed from the entry to the far side of the room. Only one set, moving inward, none returning. She followed them. The attic was narrow and strangely angled, as though the architecture had warped with time. Shelves lined the edges, filled with books that bore no spines, only numbers, each handwritten in faded script. But her attention shifted not to the shelves, but to the floor. A board near the eastern wall sat uneven. She knelt, tapped. It echoed, a loose panel. She pried it up with care, revealing a small hollow beneath. Inside lay a collection of objects wrapped in a faded linen cloth, tied with red thread. She unfolded it. At the centre lay a glove, leather, aged but intact. Its fingers curled slightly, the shape of a hand long absent, and on the cuff, smeared faintly but unmistakably, was ink. Not black, not blue, iron gall ink. A formulation once used by map makers and ledger keepers, favoured for its permanence. But this specific shade, a murky violet black with a slight metallic sheen, had not been manufactured in over 40 years, and only one person was known to have made it by hand in recent times: Andrew Merrick. The same name linked to the vanished page, the same name whispered in margins, the same man declared dead in 1951, after vanishing from a secure transport boat bound for a literary fraud tribunal. Miss Marple wrapped the glove carefully and returned to her study. She contacted a retired analyst she had once assisted in a case involving counterfeit war bonds, requesting a fingerprint comparison. The analyst owed her a favour, and he repaid it within 2 days. The results were unnerving, not for what they confirmed, but for what they challenged. The prints lifted from the ink-stained glove matched those found on a forged letter submitted in 1948, a letter designed to redirect suspicion from a missing manuscript theft at the London Library. That forger, arrested and imprisoned, had been released under a new identity and was later presumed dead. But fingerprints do not forget. And so it was confirmed. The glove had belonged to a man who should not exist. That night, Miss Marple returned to her earliest case notes, not from this affair, but from long ago, and as she turned the pages of her own diaries, carefully written in slanted neat script, she noticed something else. A name, faint, tucked in margins, always abbreviated, always just slightly different. A. Mayor. M.R.K. Am unknown. At first she thought them coincidence, but one entry, dated July 17th, 1954, stood out. Tea with Eleanor at the corner cafe. A man 2 tables away said nothing, wrote the entire time. His notebook bore the word Ashfield. She had underlined it. Ashfield. The name of a home. A ghost. A book that wasn't there. She pulled 3 books from her own shelves. Ones she had read, annotated, but not in years. In each, near the inside back cover, a name had been written in pencil so light it was nearly invisible. A. Merrick. Not a signature. A notation. A claim. She returned to the attic the following day, This time she brought a magnifier and a fresh journal. Each item she touched, she catalogued. Each title she opened, she scanned. Of the 47 books stored beneath the floorboards, 12 contained marginalia in the same distinctive hand. 7 referenced real-world events that had since occurred. 5 matched unpublished storylines later submitted to anonymous literary competitions. And one, just one, contained a name she had never seen before. Her own. J.M. knows too much already. The ink was old. The page was dated March 28, 1971. But that was impossible. She hadn't even stepped foot inside Page and Spine until 1973, and yet, there it was. She closed the book slowly. The silence wasn't empty. It was watching. There was something deeper at work now. Not just clues and suspects, but chronology itself. As though time, too, had been organized like a bookshelf. Titles rearranged, endings withheld. She no longer believed the shop had simply been a location. It was a mechanism, a place of curation, of convergence, and the man behind it, if he could be called that, had written himself out of life, only to return within the margins of those who continued reading. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. If you're still listening, still following the fingerprints that ink can't erase, subscribe. The past is closer than it seems. Chapter 10. The False Confession. The letter arrived without warning. No return address, no postmark, just a folded sheet of thick parchment hand-delivered to the front desk of the St. Mary Mead Constabulary. The constable on duty, a young man not yet settled into his boots, opened it cautiously, expecting a complaint about noise or an anonymous grievance regarding hedges trimmed too short. But what he found inside stopped him cold. It was a confession, not a vague suggestion of guilt or a cryptic admittance, a full, detailed recounting of the events that had occurred inside Page and Spine. A timeline, a motive, a claim to have placed the man behind the shelf. The description included details never released to the public. The exact positioning of the broken globe, the smell of lavender wax lingering on the book cart, the direction the clock faced at the moment it chimed 12, and at the bottom, a signature. Peter Lyle. Miss Marple heard of it an hour later, summoned to the station not as a consultant but as a curiosity. After all, the case had already defied expectations. But when she saw the name, her expression did not shift. She merely folded her hands and said, "That's quite impossible." Peter Lyle had been convicted in 1983 of literary fraud, accused of planting falsified personal letters inside rare books, claiming they were original author material. He had served 15 years and, after release, had been quietly relocated. And then, 2 years ago, he had been returned to custody, this time not for forgery, but for impersonation of a federal archivist. He was, at the time the letter was delivered, still in prison. Not in a halfway house, not recently released, inside, confirmed by fingerprints, witness logs and security footage. The authorities were baffled, but Miss Marple wasn't. She didn't believe the confession for a moment, not because the facts were wrong, but because they were too right. She read the letter 3 times, each slower than the last. The handwriting was measured, clean, almost rehearsed, and then she spotted it. A single phrase. The weight of the globe was the same as the silence it left behind. Poetic. A little too poetic. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the tone, the phrasing. She'd read it before. Not in evidence, not in letters, but in fiction. She retrieved the unpublished page left behind by the stranger with the satchel, the one supposedly authored by Agatha Christie, and there it was, buried in the middle of a paragraph. The globe, now broken, left a silence so heavy it seemed to carry weight. Different structure, same idea, almost identical in spirit. And then the question rose. Why confess to a crime you couldn't have committed? unless you knew what really happened, unless you were reciting, or worse, rewriting. Miss Marple began to suspect the letter was not intended to mislead the police. It was intended to narrate the story from within. Someone had laid out a false trail, carefully, as if composing the next chapter of a book still unfolding. She walked back through the case notes, the inconsistencies, the pages recovered from margins and attics. Each piece hadn't just served as evidence, they had acted as narrative devices, character introductions, plot reversals, misdirection, the attic discovery, the anonymous visitor, the mirror that revealed someone unseen. Each clue had come in proper sequence, too proper, like beats in a mystery novel. But what if they were? What if someone, not a murderer, not a criminal, had been constructing the story? Miss Marple revisited her earliest notes. The timing, the details, the messages left just for her, the ink, the fingerprints, the fact that every lead returned, in some shape or form, to one impossible name: Andrew Merrick. He had vanished in 1951, declared gone after stepping aboard a boat and never stepping off. But she now believed he hadn't disappeared. He had erased himself from the real world, stepped sideways, not into obscurity, but into the framework of fiction itself. And now he was rewriting it, not through force or fear, but by authorship. The letter, signed by Peter Lyle, hadn't been written to confess. It had been planted, a breadcrumb, a prompt, as if daring someone, anyone, to pick up the narrative and finish it. Back at home, she pulled a small journal from a locked drawer, her personal record of the case, filled with thoughts she hadn't dared speak aloud. As she flipped to the most recent page, she froze. There, in the lower corner, beneath her own writing, another line had been added. A line she had not written. JM is close, but not yet ready. The ink was fresh, but the book had not been opened in days. She sat in silence, the fire flickering low beside her. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. This case was no longer about solving a crime. It had become something else entirely. A puzzle not of action, but of authorship. And as the evidence grew stranger, books that vanished, titles that mirrored truth, strangers who came and went without trace, she began to see it clearly. Someone had been writing reality, and they had left her not as detective, but as protagonist. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her, and perhaps waiting for you. If you've noticed the storytelling itself, if the fingerprints now feel familiar, subscribe. The next chapter won't be written. It'll be remembered. Chapter 11, The Last Bookmark. The discovery, as with all the others in this strange tale, came not through force or deduction, but through detail. A bookmark. Pressed between pages of a book Miss Marple had already examined twice. She had marked it as irrelevant, a commonplace novel titled The Winter Guest, with no publisher, no author, and no ending. Its typeface was uneven, the kind used by small presses or private writers in the earlier 20th century. A page near the centre had been torn out, as if the book itself was trying to forget what it once held. But tucked inside, flat and deliberate, was something she hadn't seen before. A strip of thick vellum, no more than 5 inches long, rough at the edge, as if cut by hand. Along its bottom ran a thin band of embroidery, too faint to be decorative. When held to the light, the pattern revealed itself. Not letters, not a signature. A railway schedule, not printed, stitched. And in the centre, nearly invisible unless the light caught it at precisely the right angle, a location, Tarnby Halt, a place that hadn't existed on maps since the late 1950 SS. It was an abandoned stop, more platform than station, once used for cargo shipments and discreet exchanges during the war. After the lines closed, the structure remained, forgotten, overgrown, and now, perhaps, remembered only by fiction. Miss Marple packed her coat and gloves and took a taxi as far as the lane would allow. From there it was a walk through sodden fields and tangles of frostbitten bramble. The wind carried no birdsong, just the distant creak of old wires and the hush of something waiting. Tarnbeholt was still there. Barely. 2 benches, a fractured canopy, a rusted sign missing its final letter. She approached the western bench, the one described in a footnote from an earlier manuscript left inside page and spine. A note she had previously dismissed as stylized fiction. Under the seat where no one waits, first editions lie like confessions. She knelt slowly. There was no visible compartment, no latch, no trick panel, but the ground beneath the bench was soft. Too soft. She pressed into the earth. It gave way. And there it was. A wooden box, aged, iron-bound, lined in red velvet faded with age. She lifted the lid with care. Inside, books. 12 of them, each pristine, unread, their covers bound in colours so deep they seemed to absorb the light. Each bore a handwritten title, none of which existed in catalogues, archives or collector inventories. The paper was ragged but strong. The pages smelled of ink and cedar, and at the top of each flyleaf, a name. A different one each time. Names that to the average reader would mean nothing. But to Miss Marple, they were a list. Evan Walsh, Clara Renshaw, Henry Bell, Ruth Leland. Each of them. Authors who had vanished, writers of minor renown, mostly. Poets, dramatists, novelists who had disappeared without reason or record between 1938 and 1962, each presumed lost to accident, war, or madness. And yet here, in this buried box, their unpublished final works rested quietly together, as if waiting to be rediscovered, or deliberately kept hidden. She scanned the spines. The titles spoke of secrets. No one leaves, margins unwritten, the man with a story too long. The Book of Rooms. She paused at the last one. The Book of Rooms. She had seen it mentioned before, in a fragment discovered beneath the floorboards of the attic. It had been written in a hand she now recognized, though still had not confirmed. A hand that signed only in initials. She lifted the book, and as she did, a folded page fell from its pages. It was a deed, stamped, signed, notarized. Its date, June 11th, 1946. The property, a commercial unit in St. Mary Mead, listed as a bookshop, and the name, typed cleanly at the bottom, above the line of ownership, Andrew Merrick. There it was. The name that had haunted the margins, ghosted across books, slipped into signatures, whispered from the attic and the mirror and the hollow shelves. He had owned page and spine. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, legally, structurally, documented. He had placed himself at the root of it all, and perhaps he had never left. Miss Marple sat on the edge of the broken bench, the wind now heavier, as if the air had shifted beneath the weight of recognition. The mystery had always seemed external. Who placed the body? Who left the note? Who vanished? But it was never about the events. It was about control. About authorship. Someone had been writing the truth in real time, using people as paragraphs, places as punctuation. The clues were chapters, the footprints, sentences, the misleads, genre tropes. And now they were reaching the final act. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking, not in malice, but in design. Someone, perhaps no longer truly living, perhaps never fully dead, had been building the narrative as it unfolded, scripting the twists just as Miss Marple approached them, and leaving behind just enough silence for her to fill with thought. And that name, Andrew Merrick, had not simply returned. It had never left. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And soon it will be waiting for you. If the line between author and reader has started to fade for you too, subscribe. The last chapter doesn't begin, it reveals. Chapter 12. She was never fiction. There are revelations that change the course of a case. New facts, hidden motives, forgotten timelines. But then there are revelations that do not change the case at all. They change reality. Miss Marple sat in the glow of lamplight, the deed to Page and Spine beside her teacup, her notes fanned out like leaves caught in a pause of wind. Across the room, the fire sighed in its final hours, flickering orange across the face of a name long buried. Andrew Merrick, the author who never published, the collector who vanished, the man who, by every measure available, was dead. And yet, she had his signature on her desk, a fingerprint match, a paper trail, a pattern stitched across events too precise to be coincidence. The case, once shapeless, now had a frame. But the frame no longer surrounded the crime. It surrounded her. She returned to the station that morning, not to inquire, but to confirm. There had been another note, slipped through the constable's mail slot with no stamp. Inside, folded 4 times, was a newspaper clipping, yellowed, dated 1967. The headline, "Woman claims fictional character based on her life." Beneath it, a photograph, grainy, black and white, tilted slightly. The woman looked familiar. Not because Miss Marple had met her, but because the woman looked exactly like her. Same posture, same lace at the collar, same shape of cheekbone, but the name printed beneath read Annabelle Marchmont. She blinked, studied it. Annabelle Marchmont had been the name of a background character in a short story Miss Marple had read in her youth. A woman who lived in a village, solved local puzzles, whispered in a way that made even truth seem less certain. Miss Marple retrieved her personal edition. The character was there. A paragraph only, no dialogue, no resolution, but the description was identical. Her heart did not race. Her breath did not shorten, but something in her began to observe, not to act, but to listen differently. She flipped through more of her own diaries, her handwriting unchanged, consistent, her voice on the page familiar. But then she noticed something, not in the entries, in the spaces between them. Moments, hours, sometimes days, where no entry was made, and yet the surrounding pages referenced actions she could not recall. A book found, a name uncovered, a thought she didn't remember having until it was already written. Had she been following clues, or had she been following direction? She returned to the hollow manuscript. Chapter 13. Its final pages were marked with edits. Not corrections. Stage directions. Enter quietly. Observe, do not speak. Turn left on the 3rd step. Offer tea, decline biscuits. She will not remember. It wasn't just a manuscript. It was a script. She opened another file. From the glove in the attic, a letter too vague to be useful, but now it made sense. The detective must never remember she was part of the story. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with clarity. She searched for the man's name, the one behind the shelf. No record, no identification, but the ink-stained fingerprints had matched documents stored in the archives of Merrick Publishing Trust, an imprint dissolved in the 1950s. He had not been a victim, he had been a writer, a ghostwriter, for every one of the novels hidden in the box beneath the bench at Tarnby Halt. Unpublished works from authors who had vanished. They hadn't disappeared, they had been erased. Folded into stories, paid to write secrets as fiction. Truths too dangerous, too inconvenient, disguised in prose, buried between lines, disguised as fiction, and passed off as invention. And now, one of them had tried to leave the story, tried to end it. And someone, whoever orchestrated it, made sure he would not succeed. Miss Marple looked to the shelf, where the red book titled "No One Leaves" sat untouched. She understood. He hadn't written that book. He titled it. As a warning. Each author in the box had done the same, signed away their truths, hidden them inside fictional constructs, and when they resisted, when they tried to step out of their assigned lines, the story corrected itself, which meant Miss Marple had not simply been investigating the crime. She had been playing her part in it. She returned to her journal again. There, On the inside back cover, another message, in unfamiliar ink: the detective's mind must remain clear, but not too clear. A bookmark fell from the spine. It read, "She was never fiction." The silence wasn't empty. It was watching. She realized something terrifyingly beautiful. Someone had designed her memory to trace the clues, but not see the pattern. But the pattern was now complete. The letters, the prints, the margins. The life she had lived had been edited, and the man who started it all had once signed a letter. To the detective who thinks she is reading, welcome back. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her, and maybe waiting for you. If you're still here, still listening as memory bends to the page, subscribe. The story isn't over, but in the next chapter, it will finally remember you. Chapter 13. The chapter that was never written. The envelope was old. Not aged by time, but by intention, its edges yellowed not from years of neglect, but from a kind of waiting. The wax seal, pressed in dark red, bore no initials, only a single image, an open book with one page curled inward, as though concealing something within. Miss Marple found it on her doorstep just before sunrise, the light still thin enough to mistake dreams for memory. She brought it inside without speaking. There was no name on the front, but she did not need one. She had always known it would come. She sat at her desk, the same desk where her notes had been rewritten by unseen hands, where timelines had folded into each other, where fiction had begun to write back. She broke the seal. Inside, a manuscript. Roughly bound, handwritten in the familiar looping script she had traced through attic floors, forgotten novels, margin notes, and mirrored reflections. The first page was blank. The second bore a title, "The Chapter That Was Never Written." She turned to the first line. The detective arrives too late, not because she was slow, but because she was written to be just behind. It read like prophecy, but also like memory. The story that followed was not unfamiliar. It was the story she had lived. The red book, the hollow shelf, the tea that went cold, the man who vanished into a crime scene that may never have occurred. Every moment described in past tense. But something was wrong. It wasn't just her life in the manuscript. It was her thoughts. Lines she had never said aloud. Feelings she had not even written in her journal. And then, near the final pages, the ink faded. The writing thinned. Sentences slowed. Paragraphs dissolved into single lines. Until one final page remained, nearly blank, except for a few words that ended mid-sentence. And as she reached for the truth, it occurred to her that she had been. That was it. No more. Not a torn page. Just unfinished. But in the margin, small and carefully penned, was one final annotation. Only the reader decides what is real. Miss Marple placed the manuscript down. Slowly, she looked around the room. Not for people, but for structure. She noticed the chair angled slightly toward her desk, just as it had been in the sketch of Ashfield from the unpublished story. The window latch, shaped like a crescent, matching the one described in the Lost chapter by Clara Renshaw. The mirror in the corner, the clock that had not chimed in weeks. Everything matched. Not by accident, not even by memory, by design. She stood, moved toward the shelf. Every book she had followed, every clue, every margin and false confession and reflected figure, they had not led to the murderer, they had led to her. To the moment where the story ended, but only for the characters within it, not for the ones reading. She picked up the envelope again. This time, beneath the flap, she noticed a second slip of paper, smaller, folded tightly. She opened it, no heading, just one line. If you followed every page of this mystery, then maybe you were part of the story too. And that was the moment she understood. The story had not simply unfolded, it had been shared, between reader and writer, between viewer and character, between what is seen and what is never remembered until it's too late. The silence wasn't empty. It was watching. And so were you. If you'd like to uncover more lost cases and untold truths, subscribe. There's always one more chapter just waiting to be found.